Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this debate and discussion about food systems as we look ahead to the UN summit next year that will bring together a force of countries and systems together to think about what we do to make our food systems sustainable, resilient and meet the needs of citizens. Before I say anything further, I firstly want to welcome our two sets of audience. We have our Zoom audiences, people on Zoom, and also our live stream. Thank you for joining us. A few words of the rules of the game of engagement. Those of you who are on Zoom, you should be aware that have your picture on, have your name on if you can, and make sure you're on mute. If you wish to raise a question or a query, please do use your virtual hand. If you don't know where it is, look at the icon on participants, click on that, and then you'll be able to find your virtual hand. Use that to indicate that you want to speak in terms of raise a question, a query, or a frustration. And we'll warmly take you in as much as we'll try and take as many people as we can in the hour that we have with you. Those on live stream, a warm welcome to you too. We will be taking your questions, and what you have to do is post it on the hashtag Africa Europe Foundation. Use that, and then we'll be able to take questions through that process too. This is quite a historic discussion on the back of having yesterday the launch of the Africa Europe Foundation, a significant ambition and a coming together of people and personalities and communities both in Europe and Africa to forge a different kind of alliance and create an ambitious foundation that hopes to build on what has been going on up to this point between Africa and Europe, but signal a change in tone, structure and ambition to achieve a very different kind of relationship between both continents, looking at their interdependence, mutuality, and actually their ability to create significant markets of trust, but also improve the lot of citizens on both sides, but in particular in Africa. So it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation around food systems. Those of you who are in the game, if you like, in the kind of issue of sustainability and food systems will be aware that next year, there is this significant summit taking place in September. And this conversation is about how do you prepare, plan, and engage with that process, building on where we come from, but in the context that we've had one of the biggest blips in history. By that, I mean that so much was being planned and thought about in terms of COP, the various COP processes, the various processes for ensuring, towards an action against the impact of climate change. And then suddenly we get hit by the virus and its subsequent economic crisis. What we do know is that it's heightened inequalities, widened the gap, and made it deeper. What we also know is that on the Africa side, whilst it's been more resilient, and in fact actually feeling the impact of climate change, which as many people know, it's not the cause of much of what they're being suffering from. We know that food systems are not as resilient as they should be and can be, and we've had millions thrust into poverty and hunger. How do we make sure we build differently in this context and think about what needs to be done as we move forward? We have two interesting contributors for you to engage in this debate as we focus on what needs to be done, who needs to be thought about, and what are the key characteristics we need to build on to make sure that we're able to achieve some of the ambition that we have for food systems. First, I would like to warmly welcome Jocelyn. Jocelyn who is working in the UN, in the FAO, responsible for Africa and parts of the region there, and will be sharing with us her thoughts on this issue. Jocelyn, a warm welcome to you. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you for having me.
Lovely to see you. Thank you for being with us. Jocelyn, the question I have for you is, given the complexity of the ecology underpinning and around food systems, what, from your perspective, I know this is a difficult question, but we do that, it's because to get to the heart of the issues, what do you think are some of the sticking points that we need to be thinking about? And out of those, what are the one or two things that we should really focus on to accelerate change? So that on the first hand, tell us what you think are the sticking points, which I know are complex, but it'd be useful for all of us to understand how interdependent or complex the system is. Over to you, Jocelyn. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure. And hello to everyone. I want to start with, first of all, saying what are the sticking points for agriculture and food systems? And that feels like a very overwhelming question because when I think of agriculture, I think of crop production, I think of water security, I think of desertification, I think of soil science, fisheries, forestry. I mean, the list goes livestock, the list goes on and on. So it's really hard to bring this down. But if I were to really talk about the two sticking points that have been really an issue here in Africa and that dog us all are the issues of the effects of climate change. And many of the people who are affected by climate change, coastal persons, fisheries, fisherfolk, small business owners, small producers have nothing to do with affecting the climate. They're not carbon emitters. They're not using huge amounts of fuel. And so climate change is an enormous problem. Second, conflict. I mean, you can't talk about Africa and not talk about conflict and the economic downturns around there. And conflict and disasters. COVID-19 is just yet another disaster in Africa. It's one of many. In fact, there are people in Africa, we talk about this every day in the Food and Agriculture Organization, that, desert locusts, malaria, conflict, oh yeah, and COVID as well. So it's just on a long list of other challenges. Might I add, in this particular context, I really want to push the point that this particular COVID-19 crisis started as an animal disease. It's a zoonosis. It jumped from animals into humans. And what troubles me, and where I think we've lost the plot here, is that in all of our discussions about human health and protective equipment and vaccines and everything, we have missed this enormous opportunity to address zoonoses. And 70% it's estimated that up to 70% of human diseases are caused by animal diseases. So if we can get this one right, then we can get so many more right. If we miss this opportunity to address the animal health systems and the animal production systems, then we've what have we learned from these millions of people that have been affected and the hundreds of thousands of people who have died? Thank you.
Justin, thank you for making that point. And I think it's one of those things that, that's why we have people like you in this conversation. It's about what have we missed and what we've lost from the left field, if you like. But you make a really interesting point, an important point. From your perspective, therefore, given this issue is being missed, is this something that the summit that next year or other multilateral fora needs to address urgently? Are you doing something about it in context of this particular issue about animal to human disease?
Absolutely, and absolutely, the Food Summit will have a whole section on animal diseases and the processing. And it's not just how you raise the animals, of course, it's how you process them, the abattoirs or slaughterhouses, how they're packaged, all those kinds, how consumers cook, and what how we deal with traditional diets. So absolutely, we'll be part of it. And for FAO, the One Health approach, which is not just focusing on veterinarian diseases, but brings together environmentalists, the gender aspect, the youth aspect, as well as, of course, the veterinarian aspect and the human health aspect. FAO brings these together just today. I was part of a UN One Health transfer of protective equipment to Ghana. So we feel very strongly about this holistic approach, and we continue to push it. And I will note also, very interestingly, in the FAO, on our emergency team for all COVID, we have animal health advisors as embedded into our emergency teams. Thank you.
Justin, thank you so much. And actually, in an important way, you've expanded this agenda beyond just food systems. And actually, you've highlighted the sophisticated ecology that we need to be thinking about. And as today is the first day of our Africa-Europe Days, I hope that those who are participating from now on from today and onwards, will think about this issue, actually, because it's at the heart, actually, of a system that creates healthy livelihoods and well-being in communities. So thank you for raising that point. On a final point, if I can push you on this a little bit, is what can we do cross-sectorally, between government, civil society, private sector, to work in a different way, if you like, or what are the instances where they can work together to harness the opportunities, not necessarily focus on the problem, the opportunities to actually move in a direction where we are able to look at something next September, let's say, and beyond, that is meaningful on this agenda?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, we need to have an understanding that we're already working together in so many ways. 80% of our food comes from the private sector or smallholder farmers. So, and civil society, the producer groups that support those farmers and bring them together so that they can do economies of scale is already built in. So you already have some civil society, private sector working together with government. We need to understand our differences. I have worked in both, and they have very different processes and try not to impose on each other. When you say in government, oh, well, why can't we do it like the private sector does? Well, there's reasons why that. So understand each other better, find those alliances. And I would say a big one, if I could push this one, is to treat the smallholder farmer as a private sector small business person, not as a beneficiary. That person doesn't want handouts. That person wants help to move his or her business along.
Justin, again, a very insightful comment, and I hope that others take heed, is that, when you think of the private sector in Europe, you think of the big multinationals, Unilever and others, and the big, telecoms companies and others, and the oil and gas companies. You'd never think about the smallholder farms and smallholder community as, it's almost like the SMEs of Europe, if you think about it, but we don't think in those terms. And we really need to think about how do you underpin and foster a very different approach to smallholders and smallholding farmholds and those communities that are the bedrock of this system in the future. And thank you for making that point. Colleagues on Zoom, thank you very much. Now we'll bring you back, Jocelyn, for making some of those points, but I will bring you back. I want to encourage you again, those of you on Zoom, don't hesitate to use your virtual hand. Raise it if you want to pose any questions, and think about what you've just heard. Is there something that has, flicked your switch in terms of, yes, she's saying the right thing, or are there things that you disagree with, or actually there are points that have been missed in this opening section? And so while I give you time to think about that, I also want to encourage you to use a Zoom chat. It's a very important facility. Make sure that you're able to jot down your idea on that, or discuss with each other, pose questions, but also if you've got resources or ideas, put them on the Zoom chat, and we'll be keeping them, don't worry, for posterity, but also for recording some of the key ideas that come out of this session that we can build into the work of the Africa-Europe Foundation as we move forward. I want to move to Usman. Usman, thank you for joining us. Very warm welcome to you. I just need you to take yourself off mute. Hello.
I am off mute already, waiting for you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. I know you're in Kigali at the moment, and thank you for making the time to come, join this conversation. You are also co-chair of the strategy group of the Africa-Europe Foundation, and one of the key strategy groups on agriculture, food, etc. From your point of view, it would be good to hear you. We've just heard from Jocelyn about what the sticking points are and what the issues are that we need to be thinking about in relation to food systems. I want to flip it the other way to a certain extent, is what do you see as the opportunities, or where does Europe and Africa need to work differently and better to share knowledge and practice? Because often there's a myth that the good practice comes from Europe and Africa adopts it, or Africa has to kind of change its habits because Europe thinks differently. This is a different agenda, which is what the Africa-Europe Foundation is about. It's not about that one-way traffic. It's about how can we share and exchange ideas and practices to scale the kind of ambition that exists on both parts of both continents, if you like, to really revolutionize food systems. Over to you, Usman.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Good evening for those who are joining us late. It's a pleasure and an honor to join you here. Let me start by saying that right now, this day and age is the best moment for Africa and Europe to work together. The last 20 years have nothing in common with the prior 40 years since independence. For most of us who've been in this profession in the 80s to the 90s, those were days where you wouldn't see anything moving in any right directions across Africa. The last 20 years have been the longest sustained period of economic growth across the continent. Because we're coming from so far, there's so much more to be done. But at least we can look back at 20 years of progress and figure out exactly where did we do things right and emphasize those. So it is a different story if you're in a situation where you don't have anything in terms of good practice, success factors to go by, and a time where you have a lot that happens. That leads me to the next point, is that the partnership between Europe and Africa cannot be based on conventional wisdom, because Africa has changed quite a bit over the last 20 years. It has to be based on the facts on the ground and what's happening to rapidly transforming economies and agribusiness systems and value chains. Not having reached our goals would not negate the small progresses that have been achieved. And those is where we need to focus as we work together. So how do we sustain? How do we broaden? How do we accelerate the progress we have seen on the ground? We're talking about reducing poverty, we're talking about SDGs, reducing malnutrition, reducing hunger, creating jobs, and getting people out of very vulnerable livelihoods. So we have those different cases that we can focus and scale up, learn from it, and then take it across countries. The second, what we'll need to do between Africa and Europe is to align the agendas. There cannot be a European agenda next to an African agenda that are parallel to one another when it comes to working to one another. Of course, we're going to have all different things separate, but where we want to work together, we need to align. We need to have the same vision, the same goals, the same understanding, the same ambitions. We need to focus on the few things that we know we can do, which are important. To bring it back to the African side and to build on this 20 years, how do we deepen the policy reforms, the institutional reforms that have created space for the private sector, that given the smallholder farmers space to breathe, that has building infrastructure and the social services they need? How do we scale that up? How do we do that better? How do we scale investments in infrastructure, in social services, to make the rural areas livable, not just the urban centers, to transform the rural area for the poor and the vulnerable, but those who can be very productive if they get the right conditions. Extremely important, and we can work together on that. When we think about the SDGs, when we think about ending poverty, when we think about ending hunger, we often rush to the solutions, and we have so many different competing goals. And that's where we need to be a little bit more vigilant, step back. We don't have a lot of time because of the scale of poverty, but we also don't have unlimited resources. How do we create synergies between the need for social protection, mitigation of harm, and investing in productive capacity for competitive environments to allow the smallholders, the emerging business value chains to create wealth and asset for people to finally leave vulnerability and get better livelihoods. Europe and Africa can cooperate and work around that. That will also extend into the food systems. I think the fastest transforming food systems are the African food systems right now. If you look at the urban areas, just about 10 years ago, the value chains were very short. What happened in the villages remained in the villages. You grow your stuff, you harvest it, you bring it in the home, you cook it, you eat it. Very little bit will live. Right now, the chains are as long as from West Africa to the United States or Europe. Things are ready to cook, ready to eat, packaged, processed. So those rapid transforming food systems don't just have risk related to zoonotic diseases, but the food safety, to innovation, to create much more competitive SMEs and agro-industries that can tap into the fast-growing demand in the African urban centers. So there's so much out there to work with around that I think that Africa and Europe are in the best situation today that I've ever been to work productively based on a win-win formula, emphasizing what worked in Africa, how it can be scaled up and scaled out to speed up the pace of progress.
Usman, thank you very much for that. Wise words and a different kind of tone for what we need to do as we move forward. The thing that I'm interested in is politics and money. And you know as well as I do, and many people in the audience, that the politics of the relationship between Africa and Europe matters, as does the investment flows. Say a little bit about your thoughts on that. And while I do, I'm just warning people, if we don't get lots of hands up, I'm going to come to those of you who are in Nigeria. I can see Ayaboya, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Sylvester in Kenya, Sarah, Mbago from IFAD. We have Zinab also. So I'm putting you on notice. I'll come and grab you on the Zoom chat. Please be prepared so that I can call you in for the conversation. So say a little bit about that, would you, Usman?
Thank you. Perfectly. Part of my work, or what I do, is to help the African Union's member states to track progress on very many different fronts. And investment, starting with public, before we get to private. You look at African countries from the mid-90s to about 2015, they doubled annual outlays for agriculture. Since 2015, they're pedaling back to stopping and investing less. For the first time in 20 years, they have stopped increasing the amount of investment in agriculture. That is a no-no.
Yeah.
We have come so far that we cannot stop. So the governments have to be at the forefront and continue to invest as they've done in the past, first. Second, the best way to use development assistance is when the governments are at the front seat, driving the agenda, putting in their resources, and shaping the framework for others to come in and to add value to what they do. So you cannot have more investment in Africa if you don't have, on the public side, government leadership. So we have to reverse the stagnating or declining public sector investment in agriculture in Africa first. Second, on the private sector end, these are the best times, again, for returns to private sector investment. Yes, there's a lot of issues about de-risking. There's a lot of issues about not exactly being familiar with the African environment. That's where the government and Europe, we're talking about partnership here, can create a framework that reduces the risk that investors will face. It's just not about money. It's about the regulatory environment. It's about institutional setup. It's about the connection between the private sectors. And I think the fastest growing segments in the agricultural systems in Africa right now are the processing sectors. Exports within Africa are being counted in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Exports outside of Africa is counted in the tens of billions of dollars.
Exactly.
So the money to be made in African agriculture is in African demand for African food. And there's a huge space for European investors, whether you're talking about dairy, whether you're talking about processing traditional food stuff, whether you're talking about processing imported staples like wheat and others. There is a huge potential there. Europe and Africa could find a framework that would make it easy for the European investors to dare, quote unquote, to get into Africa and to seize this potential.
Well, Usman, thank you for responding so effectively. I'm glad you made the point because, I always often find on this agenda, we miss that. We often miss that. It becomes kind of holier than thou about ending food poverty, etc. And I want to say to Jocelyn, I'll bring you back later, but it might also, those of you who, feel the same way, is that UN Food Summit that's happening next year won't mean a jot if it doesn't look at market economics, sustainable investment, so we can scale opportunity and de-risk private sector investment that's supported by an enabling environment by governments. There has to be a chapter on that, and there has to be a discussion about that. Otherwise, it's meaningless for many people. But that's perhaps too bold on my part. But let's see how many of you react. I want to bring Ayobayo from Nigeria. welcome. Have I pronounced your name? Have I pronounced your name correctly?
Yeah, you tried very well. My name is Ayobayo Babade.
Ayobayo, thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for
very much. I really
joining
appreciate
us.
this opportunity. Yeah. So, interestingly, the first point I was about to make was the final point made by the last speaker on. But I was looking at, I would look at the challenges vis-a-vis the opportunities for agriculture. In Africa. So, and then the first one, which I will point out, is electricity, because many at times that is a huge problem for processing. And then, but in that challenge is the opportunity for solar. And then because it's a tropical continent, sunlight is extremely is so it's in abundance, and so that's the opportunity for solar powered processing plants, because a large number of food is lost in that chain. For example, in 2018, 60% of tomatoes that were harvested didn't get to the market. Yeah. And then so a lot of them got spoiled on the road and all that. So that can be curbed if there are processing opportunities right there. And then so there's opportunities there as well, and that can be curbed, or that can be harnessed by having good electricity, and that can be gotten from solar.
So Ayobayo, can I just ask you, what would you, because there's a number of people I want to take and I'm already at half time. What do you want from government in Africa and government from Europe? But also just say to me, are you an active citizen, or are you from an organization?
Yeah, I'm an active citizen. I'm out of an organization. I'm based in Lagos, Nigeria. I am on the board of Transport Farms. Transport Farms is a 50-acre cassava plantation. We own a 50-acre cassava plantation in a place called Odeda local government area of Ogun State in Nigeria. As well as I'm also on the board of Fox and Corpus, which is a solar solution company here in Nigeria. So I'm
excellent. Hence your point. Now it makes sense. Absolutely. Good.
So first, from government of Nigeria, and there are about just 4 solid things that the government in Africa should do to make agriculture.
Okay, go for it. What are those 4 things?
One, I'll take it very briefly. One is electricity, which I said the opportunity in solar. Second, infrastructure, which can be gotten by partnership between the public and the private sector. Quite a number are currently done in Nigeria and in other African countries, and that can be enhanced. Third is in the area of security, which is largely boiled down part of the government. A very sad example is what happened in Nigeria, where 43 rice farmers were beheaded on the farm, and that's one thing that government needs to do. And then the fourth is on youth inclusion in agriculture, because a large number of times agriculture is not encouraging for the youth, and that is one reason why a large number of youth are into agriculture and are looking for how to move over to Europe. And then on the part of European governments to encourage investment in Africa in agriculture. And that is one thing, in giving them enough grant and assistance towards setting up processing plants and processing companies in Africa to enhance agricultural production between both states, as well as also partnering with government and partnering on improving infrastructure in Africa, as well as assisting in ways in improving security in Africa. In that way, you can see that agriculture would be a meaningful one for everybody, and Europe will benefit immensely from the agriculture in Africa, because we have a lot of arable land that can be used for agriculture. Thank you so very much.
Ayobayo, thank you so much. And you know that I'm so glad you came in. One of the things that occurs to me, as someone who's from East Africa, born in Uganda, I love cassava frit. And you know this, I'm just waiting for someone to create the idea of making the cassava frit as popular as the Belgium and the French frit. So I hope someone does that as a result of some of this conversation, because they're delicious. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to move to I want to move to Driss. Driss, can you are you there? And please introduce yourself. Okay. I don't think I have you. You need to unmute yourself, Driss. I can see you.
Sorry. Okay. Now it's okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Perfect. So thank you for giving me this chance, to talk a little bit about this issue, which is really very interesting, not only for Africa, but also for Europe as well.
Driss, can you just say a little bit about you? Are you again? What are you part of? What organization or agency, or are you here as an active citizen? Say something about yourself.
Okay, take me as an active citizen, but I am a member of Mazagan Institute for International Affairs. I am a researcher, as I introduced myself before in one of the sessions.
Ah, right.
But now, yeah, but now, like, in order not to take much time, because I
Sure.
know you have limited time and you have many people to introduce.
Indeed, please
to
go
talk
for it.
about that. Okay, thank you. So I would do two comments on previous talkers. Like one of the Osman talked about about like giving people the opportunities to stay in the rural area. If we don't provide these people conditions and means to stay there and to do agriculture, they would go into the city because they will be forced to go there, and then no one is going to do agriculture, and no one is going to take care of it. And I would also comment on Ayabayo from Nigeria, who talked about the fact that we have a lot of sun in Africa. So we need to manage these resources in a wise way, so that like agriculture would benefit from it to a high extent. So here comes my intervention.
Yeah.
Like I think the summit, the food summit system, which is going to take place next year, is one of its objectives is to achieve higher annual growth rates for Africa. And we all know that Africa relies on agriculture in its economy. Many countries rely on it anyway. So I think the most like biggest part that we need to take into consideration and we need to address is land and water management.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of resources in Africa, but I don't think they are like managed in the right way.
Okay.
We have, for example, in Morocco, Morocco established a big, like solar energy plants in Ouarzazate and in other regions, which is really promising for agriculture. So this is, like what I mean by wisely using the resources for agriculture. The last thing that I would talk about is transferring of good practices from Europe to Morocco, and also capacity building as my last point.
Okay.
Like most agriculture don't have this capacity and
Sure.
to know how to manage agricultural, like exploitations.
Sure. Thank you, Driss. Thank you very much. And the thing I would like all of you to think about, and you can come back. I won't call you back necessarily to respond to this, Driss. Is that how do you enable the growth of private sector enterprise on solar, land and water management that is sustainable and has the capacity for Africa to grow homegrown talent, rather than having private sector companies from Europe, I suppose, taking a sweep of the cash, which is not meant to be a total criticism, but I think that's of the past. I think it's how do you create homegrown African growth in terms of enterprise. I want to go to Sarah. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for responding to my challenge to call you in. Sarah, do introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm the only Sarah on this forum.
I hope so too. I had to take a chance. Absolutely. Thank you. Say again.
My name is Sarah Bagobunu. Thank you very much. And I'm the regional director for IFA, the International Fund for Agriculture for Eastern Southern Africa. And I know Osman for many years, so it's good to see him here. And it's nice also to hear from you, Jocelyn. Of course, as you know, the IFAD mandate is very clear. It's really centered around transformation and putting smallholder farmers and communities at the heart of that transformation. So it really resonated to me when Jocelyn mentioned that smallholder farmers are not beneficiaries, they're the private sector. And I think Osman also alluded to really talking about, empowering key stakeholders in this space. My key concerns is that we have continually overemphasized the only single role that smallholder farmers play, the production of food, but have not really looked at all the other services that they're playing. For instance, the ecosystem services they provide around pollination, water management, fertility management of soil, biodiversity protection, etc. And we don't incentivize them for this. I think the time is now for us to actually look at the full spectrum and really respect rural communities and smallholder farmers and incentivize them to continue to play those essential services. And I think we can learn from other systems right around the world, whether it is from Europe and other places, on how we can build in those incentives for fairer systems.
Indeed.
and really encouraging them to produce sustainably.
Absolutely. But Sarah, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. You make a really excellent point. But given, if I may, this is not new to those who are within Africa, right? African governments are aware of this. Can you think of any examples where any part of the African kind of ecology or governance system is doing what you need to see happening? Can you think of an examples where that is happening, which then can be bolstered by a partnership? But where's it happening in Africa?
It's happening in quite a lot of places now. When we talk about payment for ecosystem services, we can see the creation of water funds emerging around catchment areas, because there's competing demands for water resources. And we find the private sector is coming in and contributing there. We see smallholder farmers adopting technologies that will reduce runoff into catchment areas, so they incentivize there. And we also see government coming in. So it's really looking at smart partnerships that can galvanize investments in crowded and rehabilitating those catchment areas so that the energy sector can also access water use. And we can also have water and sewage accessing, particularly the urban-rural connection that Usman had discussed and presented earlier.
Okay.
But my second point, if you will, is just one last point. I don't want to hog it from all the other interesting speakers. Is the question of markets. We now have an opportunity, the Africa Free Trade Market. It opens up a huge market, but smallholder farmers, SMEs, have been excluded from this market for many years. And we see that our urban, open African markets, which are so vibrant that we love, have remained largely underinvested, and remain sectors which are not efficient. Basically, urban food distribution systems in Africa are very expensive. They drive up the cost of food because there's no investment going into those open markets. There's no upgrading of that, and it's because they're managed by municipalities. Can we get into systems where we actually plow back and modernize these open markets, which allow them more direct access to smallholder farmers and other groups to reduce the cost of a healthy diet in an urban and rural setting? And I think there are models where we have auctions, we have other types of market systems. We need to get those ideas and invest there.
Sarah, thank you for making that very important point again amongst the others you've made. But there's something about the governance, isn't there, at municipality level? Because often, from my experience, and I'm no expert, you have corruption and monopolies in that distribution system. And that's what needs to shift. That's not just something that Europe can come in and sort. Otherwise, it will be seen as being patronizing. We have to find a way, don't we, of creating that opportunity. So what would be good, if you could put on the chat or just simply set out for us, not now, what's the message that the UN Food Summit needs to really think about? And that's the message, Jocelyn, also, on the agenda you've just pointed, because actually that could be a game changer if you open up the distribution system and deal with corruption and monopolies. And what do you want from the European Union as it participates, both in the summit, but also as a part of its work on the Africa-Europe Foundation? It'll be really helpful to hear from you on that point. I need to move on. But thank you very much for making that point. I want to go to Pascaline. Thank you. Pascaline Gaborit.
Yes, thank you very much, Dharmendra. Thank you to all the speakers for a very interesting
Please do introduce yourself. I know you, but obviously it would be helpful for everybody else to know who you are.
Yes, I'm Pascaline Gaborit. I'm working for the Pilot for Dev organization, and we have a project, Pilot for Research and Dialogue, especially in cooperation with Tanzania. And I have a question, apologies to raise that, but are we going also to look at the European subsidies for the agriculture in the common agricultural policies, because there have been some reports showing that they have a huge disruption impact on the African local markets, and especially on the small farmers, knowing that a lot of people living in African countries, maybe 70% in some of the countries, are still relying on agriculture for their living.
And from your point of view, so as you've been researching and you raise that point, and I will ask others to respond. What's the issue? What needs to change then? Because I think what you're alluding, or you're implying, is really that it's creating a marketplace that's quite limited, but actually forcing people to rely on things which are not necessarily homegrown. But that might be my interpretation.
No, that's exactly what I mean. And I think there is a huge potential within your foundation to address this question. And I think there is also a huge potential in a more sustainable local-based systems and with these technologies, and also local civic groups also participating in the water management, food production, to increase the sustainability and to create more local markets. And I think that's both in Europe and in Africa. So that there are opportunities also.
Thank you. I have one. I know there's others. Please do raise your hands. I'm rushing towards time, but or against time if you like. But before I bring in our contributors to respond to some of the issues, Burak, you have been very patient. Thank you for joining us again. I know you, but do introduce yourself to our wider audience and what your question or issue is.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Great. My name is Burak, and I work in the parliament, and I'm part of the Young Mediterranean Voice program. I'm also working in North Africa. I have actually a question regarding young people, which was raised before shortly, and I want to know if and how the FAO is integrating youth and women in the work to create sustainable agricultural policies. And to build on this, I think one major problem in Africa is, which many of my friends in Africa are saying, is about corruption. And I think there is a huge local global divide where youth are getting hopeless because they can't reach out to decision makers or to high level organizations like the UN. And is there any concrete example where this bridge was created between local and global in the work of FAO? And if so, the question to Jocelyn would be, for the UN Food Summit, do you have any idea or any project where you want to include policies and projects by youth in the summit, where they can propose or present some local solutions or anything if it's on the agenda? If not, do you think, or will you do it?
Thank you very much for making that point, a very important one. And I know in all our debates that we've had over the summer and in the autumn on the Debating Africa platform, there's been a consistent issue that's been raised about youth participation, and not just for window shopping, if you like. So I want to, before I bring Jocelyn, Usman, I want to bring you back, if I may, to respond to some of the issues that we've heard in the context of the work you're doing on the strategy group on agriculture and food. So Usman, over to you to answer some of the, or reflect on some of the issues around, electricity infrastructure, which you've referred to, and the other points I made. But also, what's your view on the youth participation issue?
Thank you. It's a bit frustrating when you look at how little we've achieved in terms of electrification nowadays. I think with a little bit of focus and attention to it, we can make some little giant steps in not just electrifying the rural areas. Nowadays, using off-grid technology, the investment is not prohibitive for many countries, at least to get started. And these villages are not asking for a lot, actually. We're not talking about billions and billions of dollars to get the things moving. So you could be doing thousands of villages at a time and slowly and get it doing using off-grid, and prices are falling every time. So, and Sarah was saying, somebody else was saying about that. What you want is to make the rural areas livable. Then economic activity follows. You need the people in place for economic activity to follow. And then you'll have modern farming. You'll have off farming. You'll have new entrepreneurial people who will create a new business. We have seen that in the past. I was born and raised in the Granite Basin of Senegal, when the Grand economy was really, really flourishing. Every October, between October and February, it was about $250 million that were just coming, $500 million, $250 million just coming into that little place. Okay. And that created so much in terms of additional work that everybody could make a living during the 70s and the 60s. So if you get the rural areas again livable, people will find ways of becoming productive. And energy is part of it. Water infrastructure is part of it. You don't need huge dams. There's sustainable irrigation technologies using surface water and groundwater in a sustainable way to allow farmers to work for 12 months, not only 3 months a year when it rains. So you can get into digital technology where we're doing better. So there's so much more we could do, but there's one way you really can do it, is only if you federate across government to focus on the need of the rural space. Your education ministry, your health ministry, your infrastructure ministry, your X, Y, and Z ministry brings their own budget, their own resource, their own plan, but they converge toward the rural areas. They achieve scale and consistent currency. That is absolutely possible, and you can do that, right? And I would like to see us doing more of that across the continent. Okay. I forgot what was the second question. If there's time for it.
Yes, there is. Go. Sorry.
What
about
was
young
the second question
young
again?
people. About young people.
Oh, the young people. All right. There's something we say often, which I'm probably not necessarily agreeing with all the time. We think access to land is the biggest constraint to youth to get in agriculture. I have a question I often ask. If I had a 17-year-old daughter who would tell me today, Dad, I want to be a farmer. In most African countries, where do I send her for training? She didn't get it with mommy's milk. She has to learn the trade. So young people need to learn the profession of farming first to be productive. If you just want them to do what uncle did and auntie did, it's not only in farming, they don't want it anywhere. In any part of the world, there's no kid that want to do what daddy and mommy and uncle and auntie did. So, but how do they innovate? How do they learn the new skills? So mainstreaming of vocational and professional training to develop and upgrade skills along the agricultural value chain will create some attraction for kids who would like to get into farming. Then they will want to have land. But for now, getting land, not having the skills, not having the infrastructure, not having the power, it is not what's going to be attractive kids. So I think we have to start first with getting into the hands of the youth the skills they need to be productive farmers.
Okay.
They will get into that.
Usman, what do you think about that point that was made by Pascaline about subsidies, EU subsidies on agriculture, part of the Common Agricultural Policy? Are they a stranglehold in Africa?
You know, there's always the most limiting factor in everything we do. They may be having a negative impact, but they're not certainly the most limiting factor in agricultural development in Africa. I would suggest to folks to look at our latest publication, the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor on 2020 or 2019, where we looked at the obstacles to agribusiness and agricultural development in Africa. There's a lot we do at home that is causing more harm to agriculture before you get to the subsidies. It's true that the subsidies do create distortions around the global economy, not just getting to Europe, but also, you know, if you create problems for China and for Taiwan and for Indonesia, it is, you know, transferred to the global market and we face it. That's true, right? But that is not the most binding constraint. The most binding constraint for us right now is our regulatory and policy and institutional environment around agriculture. We have gone, you know, made a lot of progress over the last 20 years, and that's why we have the recovery that we had and growth that we had. But then also the slowing down of investment in agriculture, which is a no-no. If you're not investing in agriculture, it doesn't help you whether the EU subsidizes or not. Second, what are we doing with emerging technologies? We're talking about digitalization, with biotechnologies. How do we get those technologies into the hands of our farmers to produce? Right now, the mid segments of the agricultural value chains are the fastest, the most dynamic. The processing sectors actually are now leading exports of cereals into Africa and outside of Africa. It's no longer raw cereals. Okay. Now, there will be the bridge tomorrow between the smallholder and the demand in the urban centers. The middle class wants to eat millet, but not like it's being eaten in the villages. They want it processed, packaged, they want it refined, they want it innovative, right? If the mid-segment, the processing sector cannot do that, if they're not competitive, you can produce all the millet you won't sell it. So what are we doing about that? Anticipating where you have tens of thousands of small and medium enterprises, dominated by women, by the way, including one of my younger sisters, doing a lot of stuff, but it left alone in terms of finding the financing, the technology to be innovative, to find the markets, to manage. Yes, that's true. They are the entrepreneurs, they have to do it. But what are you doing as government to shape the environment, to allow them to create enterprises, to grow, to maturate, to build business and create jobs? Because you don't do it for them. You do it for the smallholder.
Indeed.
If they don't connect the small to the markets, there's no markets for the small. It's just like the bridges and the roads of the 70s and 80s. It's today the SMEs in the agribusiness segments.
Absolutely well said, Usman. And you're driving a powerful message back home in terms of what the African Union and others have to do in terms of getting, if you like, getting the act together domestically in order to create the right conditions. But it's a powerful message, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm so pleased you brought the issue of digital. I'm not asking you to respond to it because I'm running out of time and I want to go to Jocelyn, but I'm struck by the fact that in this agenda of food systems, we know that technology has the capacity to leapfrog stuff, especially in Africa, where the issue of biodiversity and nature-based solutions could be an absolute game changer if you had the right resources, the right technology, and the right know-how. That's one area that perhaps the EU could focus on. Jocelyn, I want to come to you before we wind up. There's been a whole rich tapestry of issues being raised here by colleagues. I want you to deal with each in turn, if you may, but start with the young people. In particular. Obviously, Usman had an interesting take on that in terms of what you do to create the right circumstances for youth engagement. But responding to Burak's point about what role will young people have in the summit happening next year, and what are your responses to some of the other agenda around subsidies and so on that have been raised by colleagues in the Zoom conversation? Jocelyn, over to you.
Thank you.
Hang on one second, we've just lost you.
What an interesting question. Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can now.
With the youth, with Africa, many populations have up to 60 to 70% of the population is being youth, young, 35 years or younger. And so I want to assure people on this call and elsewhere that youth is at the top of our agenda, from the Director General down to the local level, the country offices. At every point, we are talking about youth. It's a cross-cutting issue here in Africa. We know it has to be dealt with. Not just because we have so many unemployed youth here, but because we need to figure out who are going to be the people who feed us in the future. Exactly. The average age of the farmer in the United States, my home country, is in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
The average age of a farmer in Japan is in the early 70s.
Yes.
We need to feed the world. My children need to have food, and it's the youth of Africa. So I want to tell you, it's very much on our forefront. I don't have a direct line to the Secretary General about making sure that he
Jocelyn. We expect you. I said, what a pity. We expect you to have a direct line.
Well, I try to be a VIP, but I don't have he's not on my red phone. And but I think FAO will certainly be pushing to have youth involved. And we have, I can't go through all the examples of how we have youth. I can't agree more with Usman about how engaging them, training people on agriculture. It's interesting because people eat food. They seem to know, they think that they know how to grow food, and they're not. Those are not the same things. But there's a plethora of examples of youth. For example, my yoga teacher here in Accra, Ghana, she dries mangoes off of her tree, and she sells them to those of us who go to her yoga class. We go online now, but there's hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of examples of that and opportunities there. So I think that is both local and regional and at the global level. I do want to touch a little bit on the trade issue. I do know something about it. I want to make sure that people know the numbers. The numbers are right now that the agricultural exports, the agro products that are traded between Europe and Africa are essentially at the same levels according to the data that we looked at. And I asked for this answer just for today's. It's about $160 million each way. So, yes, subsidies, I can agree with you more. Subsidies is an issue, but there's a whole host of other issues that are before that. And you don't want to lose the plot on that one. You don't want to lose your eye on that one. But boy, we've got to deal with youth. We've got to deal with land tenure, agricultural finance. Those are other issues that we've got to deal with. Climate change, conflict. So let's not forget about subsidies, but I might put it a little bit lower down on the list right now. And then in terms of access to markets for those youth, one thing I just want to note is there's a lot of markets happening in many African countries. They're informal. They are on the roadside. They are might not be, your ShopRite or things like that. There's a lot, with exception of a very few countries. There's a lot happening. It's a question of how do you take those informal markets, make them safe in this time of COVID, and make them more profitable along the chain, so that the farmer is getting as much of the piece of the pie that the trader is, that the wholesaler is, and that the processor is. So lots happening. And yes, there are some breakdowns in the chains, but the enabling environment, if we can input the policies to address that, that should not just input the policies, but enforce them. Enforcement is a big issue in Africa. I'm going to stop there. I'm the UN. We remain neutral about
Of course you do.
issues around governance and
Yes.
corruption. So I'm going to
Sure.
stop there.
No, I'm not going to ask you to comment on that. But that thing about creating, markets and that thing that, without creating the circumstances for effective investment that also supports homegrown SMEs and talent, the food agenda will miss one of its biggest acceleration points, surely.
The homegrown talent missing the acceleration point?
Well, in the sense of the investment that's required, how do you support the smallholder and the SMEs to scale and take the opportunity of what the numbers you've quoted in terms of trade are miserable. They should be 10 times, 100 times that in reality. But the only way you're going to do that is if you create the circumstances for investment within homegrown talent, but also homegrown investment in Africa.
Yeah, well, there's two things that are going on there. One is agriculture is not just about growing things, it's actually managing the process of agriculture. And we have to focus not just on productivity, as Sarah said from IFED, but the whole chain. Second of all, access to finance. It's still such a huge challenge here in Africa. And I will say, I might differ from my colleagues on here. Access to finance is always attached to access to land. Land is collateral. So I don't want to say that's completely the huge obstacle, but boy, those two hand in hand, those can be killers or game changers right then and there for people. So microfinance, land tenure systems, especially in countries that are still facing challenges in Southern Africa about land tenure. Those are some big ticket items that we need to address along with the youth. So I'll stop there. It's a huge question. I wish I could answer it.
I need to wrap up. No, it's been really good. An hour is a very short time to cover such a massive topic. We know that. But I think in this time, we have been able to I suppose, excavate some of the issues in a really meaningful way. And I think through this discussion, we've identified some key points about what needs to happen to build a capacity and capability within Africa itself, but also to identify the things that need to be on the agenda next year, not least some of the ones that have been mentioned through this debate, but also what the EU can do in this relationship with Africa as a part of the Africa-Europe Foundation. And we thank you for that. I'm not going to list them. They're there on record. You know what they are. And that's the most important thing. Thank you for participating. As I always say, without you at the end of this camera and on screen, this debate is meaningless. And also for those of you watching live stream, continue to join us on our Africa EU Days. There are a number of things happening in the next week, so tune into our website at Friends of Europe. And I want to thank both our contributors, but also thank you for being active in this debate. You take care, all of you, and continue to join us. All that's left from me is to say goodbye, mind your distance, and be safe. Bye-bye. See you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.